All I said was, "I release you." I did not know she was the only one who could save the kingdom. The morning I released her, it rained. Not the dramatic kind of rain that makes a man feel he has done something wrong. Not the cold, deliberate sheets that soak through wool and say, "Reconsider." It was a thin, indifferent drizzle, the kind that blurs the edges of things without erasing them, and I remember standing in the map room with the window open behind me and the iron-gray light coming in flat across the table, and thinking, this is the right decision. Clean. Necessary. The Iron Pact was pressing the eastern borderlands harder every month. I needed a political match, a Luna who brought an alliance, a pack at my back, a line drawn in the sand that the Pact's southern commanders would actually read. What I had instead was a garrison scribe from the Ashenvale border post who had never commanded a single wolf in her life. What I had was Sierra. I told myself I was being practical. I told my second-in-command, Aldis, that same thing, and he nodded the way men nod when they have decided not to argue with you. I told my council that the proposed match with Lady Veth of the Ironside Pact, not the enemy pact, a different one, a Western alliance. The naming was unfortunate, was strategically sound, and they agreed with the enthusiasm of men who had been waiting 3 years for me to choose anyone at all. What I did not tell any of them was that the night before, I had stood in the doorway of the records room and watched Sierra work for 6 minutes without saying a word. She had not seen me. She never did when the maps were open. She sat cross-legged on the floor rather than at the desk. She always said the floor gave her the full picture, with 3 supply ledgers spread around her knees and one of the large border charts pinned flat under her left hand. She was making a notation in the corner margin in her small, exact hand, and she was frowning at something in the eastern column that no one else had flagged, and the candle beside her was burning low and she had not noticed, and I stood in the doorway and watched her frown and thought, she is the most careful person I have ever known. Then I thought, that is not enough. Careful does not hold the border. Careful does not bring the Ironside's 300 wolves to my eastern flank. And I stepped back from the doorway and I went to bed and I told myself I had made the right choice before I had even made it aloud. The next morning I called her in and I said, as gently as I knew how, that the bond between us, the quiet, building thing that neither of us had named, was something I was choosing to release. That she was free. That I was grateful for her service. That she would be escorted back to the central settlement with a full stipend and a letter of high commendation. She looked at me for a long moment. Not with tears, not with the wounded expression I had braced for. Just with those steady gray eyes that she turned on a column of numbers when something did not add up. And for a moment, I had the uncomfortable feeling that she was running the same calculation on me, measuring the gap between what I was saying and what I actually meant. Then she said, "All right." 2 words, flat and clean, the way she logged a figure she did not dispute. She set down the notation she had brought into the meeting. She had been mid-shift. She had come straight from the records room. She still had ink on the side of her hand, and she stood, and she bowed, and she left. She did not slam the door. She did not make me feel the weight of it. She simply walked out of the map room and out of the keep, and the drizzle closed around her, and that was that. I married Lady Veth of the Ironside 6 weeks later. The Ironside brought 280 wolves to my eastern flank. Their commander signed the Mutual Defense Pact, and my council called it a triumph. Aldis called it competent. I called it done and went back to the work of running a kingdom. The Iron Pact moved 3 months after the wedding. Not where we had expected. That was the thing I would turn over for years afterward, not where we had expected. Every strategic model my commanders had built, every threat assessment, every deployment projection, had assumed the pact would push through the Keldrun Pass because that was the obvious route. Low elevation, good footing, the fastest way to my northern grain storage. We had reinforced the pass. We had positioned the Ironside wolves there. We were ready. They came through the Ashenvale Gap instead. not a route anyone had called viable. It was rocky, narrow, exposed to the northern wind, and the maps we had been working from for the last 2 years showed the eastern end of the gap as impassable before the first frost. The pack's forward column came through in late autumn, just after the first frost, in numbers that suggested they had been staging there for months. Aldi's came to me in the middle of the night with the scout report, and I remember reading it twice and then sitting very still for a moment. "The eastern end of the gap," I said. "Our models showed it impassable." "They did," Aldi said. "Who updated that assessment last?" He was quiet for a beat too long. "It was flagged for review in the summer. The update was not completed." I looked at him. He met my eyes and did not flinch, which told me he already knew the answer. "Who was doing the border reviews in the summer?" I said, and it was not quite a question. He said her name. Sierra, who had left in the spring, who had been doing the border survey work, the slow, unheralded work of checking the field reports against the physical reality, of updating the maps when the maps were wrong, of sitting on the floor with 3 ledgers and a candle, and finding the thing in the eastern column that no one else had flagged, until I released her. Until I handed her a stipend and a letter, and sent her back to the central settlement, because she was not political enough to hold the border. The eastern end of the Ashenvale Gap was passable in late autumn. She had known it. She had been 3 weeks into the revision when I dismissed her, and the work had sat incomplete because no one else had known to finish it. I got my commanders in the war room before dawn. The pack's forward column was already through the gap and moving toward the northern storage. We had 2 days, perhaps 3, before they reached the granary settlement. The Ironside wolves were positioned at the Keldron Pass, which was now entirely the wrong location, and it would take them a day and a half to redeploy, if they moved immediately, which required their commander to agree to leave the pass undefended on my word alone, which he was not yet inclined to do. My northern pack commander, a steady man named Oreth, laid out the problem in flat, concise terms. We could not reach the storage in time with the forces we had available in the north. The ground between our current position and the granary was not the ground our models described. Our maps of the gap's eastern reach were 2 years out of date, and none of us knew the current terrain. I knew one person who did. "Aldi's," I said, "where is she?" He had already found out. She was 40 miles south of us, at the central settlement, doing administrative work for the regional pack coordinator. She had, as far as anyone could determine, not complained once since her return. She had simply started doing the available work with the same focused quiet she had always brought to everything. I rode out that morning with Aldi's and 12 of my wolves. 40 miles in the rain, which had not stopped, which had, if anything, decided to become serious about itself. The thin drizzle replaced by a steady, cold, purposeful downpour that turned the road to clay and made the trees on either side look like they were trying to disappear. I did not think about what I would say. I thought about the gap and the granary and the 2 days I had, and the maps that were wrong and the column of numbers in the eastern ledger that she had been frowning at the night before I released her. We found her in the coordination hall, which was a large, practical stone building that smelled of paper and wet wool, and she was at a table in the back with a pack of regional water route reports spread around her in a pattern that I recognized, the same cross-referencing system she had used in my records room. And she looked up when we came in through the door, and she went very still. She did not look afraid. She looked the way she had looked when I released her, steady, measuring, running the numbers on the situation as it was actually presented. I was the Alpha King of Ashenvale. I had ridden 40 miles in the rain. I was standing in her coordination hall with mud on my boots and 12 wolves behind me, and I did not have any of the words I should have had, so I used the only ones that were true. "The gap," I said, "the eastern reach. You were updating the assessment when I dismissed you. I need what you found." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I have it." Not, I told you so. Not, you should have let me finish. Just, I have it. And she reached under the table. She had brought it with her, the incomplete revision. She had simply folded it into her own work when she left, the way you carry the piece of work that is not finished because you cannot make yourself set it down, and she unrolled it on top of the water route reports. It was 43 days of field survey, partial but dense, in her small exact hand, with elevation notations and frost line data, and a set of penciled route alternatives in the gap's eastern section that she had not yet had time to write up formally. The passable route through the Lay Gap was marked in red. There were two of them. One was the route the pack's column had used. The other one, the one she had noted with a small asterisk and the words check footing, possible, narrow, ran parallel to the first and arrived at the granary storage from the north. From the direction, the packed column would not be watching. I looked at her. She was watching me read it, not with triumph. Not even with the quiet satisfaction I might have expected from a woman who had been proven right in the most concrete way possible. She was watching me the way she watched the maps, not for vindication, but for the problem still to be solved. The northern approach, I said, is it stable enough for a moving pack? In this weather, yes. The frost has hardened the upper reach. The footing is narrow in the first quarter mile, 8 wolves abreast at most. After that it opens. She paused. I didn't go all the way through. I turned back to write it up, but the frost data says it holds. How confident are you? Confident enough that I brought the report with me, she said. And that was, I understood, as certain as she was going to be, because she was not the kind of person who claimed more than she knew. She was the kind of person who marked things asterisk possible and checked footing and came back to verify before she committed them to the permanent record. I turned to Aldi's. Get a runner to Orath. The northern approach 8 abreast, move before nightfall. Aldi's was already moving. My commanders were already leaning over the table, pulling the survey toward them, reading the elevation notations with the focused urgency of men who had been handed a solution and needed to understand it immediately. Sierra stepped back from the table to give them room. It was such a practiced, quiet movement. She had spent 3 years stepping back to give the commanders room, that I had to stop myself from reaching for her arm to hold her where she was. The second route, I said, the one you marked, would you walk me through the thinking? She looked at me. Then she looked at the map. Then she sat down at the edge of the table because there was no floor space with 6 commanders around it, and she began to explain. She talked for 11 minutes. I have never, before or since, heard a person make 43 days of fieldwork sound so entirely clear. No hedging, no excessive qualification, just the data and the reasoning and the gaps she had been unable to fill before she left, and the assumptions she had made to bridge them, and how confident she was in each one. She spoke to the map rather than to the room, which was the way she always spoke when she was thinking hard, and my commanders interrupted her 4 times with questions, and she answered all 4 without pausing in her own thread. And by the time she finished, Orath had already traced the route twice with his finger, and the runner had been dispatched, and the plan was forming around the table like water finding its shape. Aldi's caught my eye across the room. He said nothing. He did not need to. We moved that night. The northern approach held. The footing in the first quarter mile was narrow and the rain made it treacherous, but it held, and the pack's column, committed to defending the southern face of the granary, did not see us until we were already through. Orath's wolves hit them from the north. The Ironside, finally redeployed from the Keldron Pass, came in from the west 20 minutes later. The column broke. Not cleanly, not without cost. We lost 7 wolves in the engagement, and I carry their names, but it broke, and the granary held, and the iron pack's advance stalled. I came back to the coordination hall 4 days later. Sierra was still there. She had not left. I learned afterward that the regional coordinator had asked her to stay and finish the water route assessment. that there was a backlog of border survey work that no one had been doing in the months since she had come back from Ashenvale, and that she had been quietly working through it with the same focused discipline she brought to everything. The coordinator had tried to get her a better table. She had said the current one was fine. I came in out of the rain. It had finally stopped, the sky a pale, exhausted gray, and I found her at the same table in the back, cross-legged on the floor beside it now with a different set of charts, and she looked up when I came through the door and she did not say anything, just waited. I had spent 4 days thinking about what to say. I had composed, in my head, several versions of a speech. One of them was stately and formal and acknowledged her contribution to the defense of the borderlands. One of them was quieter and more direct and got, eventually, to the point. One of them started with an apology, and I had discarded that one because the apology felt too small for what I had actually done, and I could not find words large enough to replace it. Standing in the doorway of the coordination hall, looking at her on the floor with her charts and her ink-stained hand, and the calm, steady way she waited for me to say something, all of the versions dissolved. What I said was, I made a mistake. She did not say it was fine. She did not say it did not matter. She looked at me with those gray measuring eyes and she said, I know. And then she waited again, because she was always willing to wait for the rest of something. She never rushed a conclusion, never assumed the first statement was the last one. I released you, I said, because I told myself that what you were was not enough. That careful was not a political match. That the work you were doing, the specific, patient, essential work of understanding the actual ground, was not the kind of thing that held a border. I stopped. The border held because of the work you were doing. The border held because you had already found the route before I sent you away. She was quiet for a moment. The border held because Orath's wolves went through the gap in the right order and Aldi's got the runner there in time, she said. I just drew the map. Sira, I know what you're saying, she said, and then more quietly, I know. I crossed the room and I crouched down beside where she was sitting on the floor, which was not a thing I had ever done in my life. I was the Alpha King of Ashenvale. I did not crouch on coordination hall floors, and I looked at her at eye level for the first time in, I realized, a very long time. She had a piece of charcoal in her right hand. She had put it down when I came in and had not picked it up again. The match with Lady Veth, I said. I heard, she said. She was not unkind about it. She was simply accurate. Is she well? She is well. She is returning to the Ironside. The alliance stands. The defense pact was the point of it, not the marriage, and the defense pact holds. I paused. The marriage did not. Sira looked at me. It was not, I said, a bond. I understood that clearly and fairly quickly. Lady Veth understood the same. There was no difficulty in it. She was quiet. I am not telling you this to argue that it makes what I did acceptable, I said. It does not. I released you because I was wrong about what you were worth, and the fact that I was also wrong about the political necessity does not change the first thing. I was wrong. She looked at the map beside her for a moment. Then she looked back at me. You went to a lot of trouble to come and say that, she said. Yes. 40 miles. 40 miles. In the rain. In the rain, I said, and something shifted in the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. The expression she got when a figure resolved into something cleaner than she had expected. What are you asking? She said. Flat, direct, the way she asked for clarification when a report was unclear, because she did not want to interpret when she could simply know. I am asking you to come back to Ashenvale, I said, not as a scribe, not as garrison staff, as my Luna. As the person who sits on the floor with the maps and tells me when the maps are wrong, because it turns out that is exactly what running a border kingdom requires, and I was too foolish to understand that until the border nearly broke. She looked at me for a long moment. My wolf had been still since I walked into this room, not the stillness of restraint, but the stillness of something that has finally stopped moving because it has arrived where it was going. 6 months of walking in the wrong direction, and the first moment I came through that door, the wolf had simply stopped and said, "Here. This is here." I could not tell her that without sounding like a man who was reaching for destiny to excuse a mistake, but I thought she already knew. She had those gray eyes that missed very little. "The survey work," she said, "the border review." "I would like it finished," I said, "by the best person in the kingdom for it. There's a backlog in the central settlement as well, the water route assessments. They're 2 years out of date in the southern regions." "I know. I would want to finish those too." "Yes. And I would want," she said, "a dedicated team, not one scribe pulled in different directions. A proper survey team. 3 people, maybe 4, with authority to access the field reports directly without going through the garrison commander every time." "Done." She looked at me. Something in her face had shifted, not the angle of the decision, but the weight of it, the way it sat. She was still measuring. But the measurement was coming out differently than it had 6 months ago in the map room, when she had set down her notation and said all right and walked away clean and did not look back. "You understand," she said, "that if you release me again—" "I won't." That was not a question. "No," I said, "it was not, I know." She picked up the charcoal from the floor. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it down again. "All right," she said. The same 2 words, but different, not the flat acknowledgement of a woman who had been handed a conclusion, but the considered agreement of one who had run the numbers and found them acceptable. The same words and a completely different weight, and I understood the difference, and I think she knew that I did. I stood up. She stood up beside me. I was a full head taller than her, which had always seemed like it ought to mean something and never quite did, because she looked at things with such level attention that the height was largely irrelevant. "I have one more section of the survey to complete," she said. "The southeastern ridge, 2 days of field work." "I'll wait." She looked at me again, checking. "You'll wait here." "I have a pack to run," I said. "I'll wait at the keep, but I'll come back in 2 days." She considered this. It was, I could tell, a version of acceptable. "The regional coordinator will need notice," she said. "She should have time to find a replacement for the water route work before I go." "Of course. I'll write a summary of where I am in the assessments, so whoever continues it has a clean starting point." "That is very like you," I said. And again, the thing in the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the expression that appeared when a problem resolved cleanly. "It's just good practice," she said, but her voice was warmer than it had been. I left the coordination hall. Aldis was waiting outside with the horses, because Aldis had been doing this for long enough to know when to wait outside, and he looked at my face when I came through the door, and he did whatever the opposite of saying "I told you so" looks like. A very particular controlled expression that managed to convey both deep satisfaction and complete professional neutrality simultaneously. 2 days, I told him. "Of course," he said, and that was all. I came back in 2 days. She was ready. She had completed the Southeastern Ridge Survey, written the transition summary for the regional coordinator, settled the water route notation to a stopping point that the next scribe could pick up without losing the thread, and packed a single bag, which sat by the door of the coordination hall with the characteristically tidy compression of a person who had been traveling between garrison posts for years and knew exactly what was necessary and what was not. We rode back to Ashenvale. It rained again, because the autumn had apparently made a commitment that it intended to keep. But this time it was less indifferent, or perhaps I simply noticed it differently, riding beside her rather than toward her through it. She did not talk much on the journey. Neither did I, but 3 hours in, when we stopped to rest the horses, she unrolled a section of the survey she had completed, the Southeastern Ridge. the new data, and spread it across her saddlebag on the ground, and showed me a discrepancy she had found in the ridge footing that suggested the eastern watchtower's foundation was less stable than the garrison's last inspection had recorded. "We should look at this before winter," she said. "Yes," I said. And I looked at the notation, and the careful cross-referencing she had done to establish the discrepancy, and the small asterisk that said verify on site before acting asterisk, and something in my chest that had been wound tight for 6 months and 40 miles and 4 days of planning speeches that all came out wrong when I was actually in the room. Something loosened. This was what I had released. This specific, careful, essential attention. The willingness to sit on the floor until the problem resolved and to leave the asterisk in rather than smooth it over, and to bring the unfinished work with her when she left, because she could not make herself set it down. I had called it not enough. It was, I understood now, the whole point. "The survey team," she said, rolling the chart back up. "I was thinking 3 people. There's a young scribe at the Eastern Garrison, Fenn. She trained under the old Boundary Commission, who would be excellent. Arrange it." She looked at me sideways. "You haven't met her." "I trust your judgment." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said, and mounted her horse, and we rode on. We reached Ashenvale before nightfall. I had sent word ahead. The keep was lit, the gates were open, and Aldi's had evidently used his discretion in preparing the household, because the staff were assembled in the inner yard in the particular quiet formation that said, "This matters, but we will not make it a performance." My commanders were there. Oreth, who had walked the northern approach in the dark and the rain, and brought his wolves through the gap that she had mapped. He looked at her when she rode in, and he gave a short, very deliberate nod. The nod of a man acknowledging a debt he cannot fully calculate. She nodded back. I dismounted and came around to her side and offered her a hand down from the horse. She took it. Her fingers were ink-stained, as they essentially always were. She had been making notations again on the last leg of the journey, small updates to the ridge section in the margins of her own draft. She looked at the keep, at the assembled yard, at the faces that knew already what her return meant. "This is a great deal of fuss," she said very quietly. "It is appropriate," I said. "You saved the northern granary." "Oreth saved the northern granary." "Sira." "I know," she said, and then even more quietly in a voice that was meant only for me. "I know what I did. I know what it was worth. I don't need it performed." I looked at her. "But I appreciate," she said, "that you came back, that you rode out in the rain, that you said the actual words." She paused. "People often don't say the actual words." "I know," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Those gray eyes, measuring and finding, for the first time that I had seen, something that resolved not just to acceptable but to something warmer than that. Something that did not need a number assigned to it. I took her hand. Not in the formal claiming gesture, not in front of the yard, not with ceremony, just in the quiet way of a man who has found the thing he let go of, and intends to hold it properly this time. Her hand was small and ink-stained and warm, and she let me hold it, and she turned back to the keep. "The records room," she said, "is the Eastern ledger still in the same place?" "Where you left it." "Good. There was a discrepancy in the autumn supply figures that I never finished resolving." "There is time," I said. "There is," she agreed. And we walked in through the gate together out of the cold into the lit keep, with the rain finally quiet above us and the work of the border still ahead, and the map still partly wrong, and all of it, something she would know how to fix. We announced the bond in the great hall the following morning, before my council and my commanders and the assembled senior staff, and I claimed her as my Luna in the formal words, spoke them plainly, without theater, the way she would have wanted it, and she stood beside me in her traveling clothes with the ink still on her hand and her chin level, and her expression the one she wore when a problem had been correctly solved. Not triumph, not relief, just the clear, satisfied acknowledgement of something that had come out the right way. Oreth led the bow, then Aldi's, then the commanders and the senior staff and the household, one by one, and she watched them with those steady gray eyes and did not look away and did not diminish what they were giving her. Afterward, when the hall had cleared and it was only the two of us and the maps and the winter light coming in flat through the high windows, she sat down on the floor with the Eastern ledger and the autumn supply figures, and I sat down across from her, on the floor, like she did, because the floor gave the full picture, and she showed me the discrepancy in the column she had been frowning at the night before I released her. It was a routing error. 17 wagons of winter stores had been logged under the wrong garrison code for 2 seasons running, which meant the northern settlement's actual reserve was lower than the formal record showed, which meant we had been undersupplying them and not knowing it, which meant we needed to correct the routing and backfill the deficit before the hard frost came. She had the correction worked out already. She had been working on it quietly across the months she was away because she could not make herself stop. "We have time," she said, "if we move in the next 2 weeks." "We'll move," I said. She nodded. She made a notation in the margin. I watched her work, the small, exact hand, the focused frown, the candle burning low beside her that she had not yet noticed, and I thought, this is what I nearly lost. Not a political match, not an alliance with 300 wolves. This specific, careful, essential person sitting on the floor with the problem until it resolved. I reached over and adjusted the candle before it burned out. She looked up. "Thank you," she said. "Yes," I said, and I stayed on the floor beside her while she finished the correction, in the quiet of the map room, while the winter came in at the windows and the border held outside. That was enough. It was, I understood now, everything.